could we start closed captioning as well?
I will. Thank you. I will turn that on since I think the recording is mine, and that way it's captured in the recording as well. All right. So again, thank you all for being here. My name is Mark Thompson. I'm the State Hazard Mitigation Officer at the Division of Homeland Security and Emergency Management. I really appreciate your time this morning to attend this webinar, as well as all the people at DHSEM and Hagerty that have contributed to building this. We believe that it's going to be informative for you and hope that you agree at the end that it prompts thoughts about what you might want to start taking on in terms of grants that help reduce your risk from natural hazards. And but you didn't come here to hear me, so we'll roll through a few introductory slides and then I'll hand it off to Vanessa. So kind of the normal, please place yourself on mute. If you have questions during the presentation, please put them in the chat. And then we'll also have time for questions and answers at the end of the presentation. If it is something urgent, please raise your hand. But again, we'd prefer to answer the questions towards the end. Next, please. So what we're really here to talk about today is sort of the breadth of FEMA's Hazard Mitigation Assistance Grant Programs and how they're working in Colorado. Because you may not be aware of everything that's available to you right now. Many of you know that we've been prioritizing the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program since last summer. We currently have 3 of those open in the application period, totaling about $56 or $57 million of federal funding. Vanessa will get a little more detail on that later. But you've also probably heard that FEMA recently published their funding notices for this year's Building Resilient, Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities, or BRIC, and the Flood Mitigation Assistance, or FMA programs. And so part of what we want to make sure you take away from this webinar is an understanding basically of what the 3 programs are, and help to drive decisions on where your potential projects might be a best fit. Next, please. And so this is the agenda that we're going to follow today. And I'm about to hand it off to Vanessa, but we'll talk about what the grants are, what the criteria are for BRIC and FMA projects, how we incorporate the Colorado Resiliency Framework into our project scoring and prioritization, and then move through each of the 3 programs, and then get to your questions and answers. So with that, I'll hand it over to Vanessa Castillo, who's here representing Hagerty Consulting, who's been a partner with DHSEM since March, and we're looking forward to a strong partnership with them, as well as you, over the next several years. So Vanessa, please take it away.
Thanks, Mark. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the overview, and I'm sorry that this keeps falling out. So the overview of the 3 hazard mitigation assistance programs. So as Mark said, they consist of the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities Program, and then the Flood Mitigation Assistance. All 3 programs, the HMGP, BRIC, and FMA, are FEMA funded and state administered. The HMGP is FEMA's cornerstone post-mitigation funding program. HMGP is directly tied to major disaster declarations. The local match requirement is generally 25%, but as we'll discuss, this was decreased to 10% for disaster declarations between 2020 and 2021. Colorado had approximately $70 million in HMGP available between these 2 years, but we'll provide an updated number in upcoming slides. The BRIC program is one of the 2 nationally competitive mitigation programs. The other one is FMA. It is not directly tied to disaster declarations, and a notice of funding opportunity is released annually. The local match requirement is 25% for most sub-applicants, except for communities that qualify as an economically disadvantaged rural community. And we'll provide a definition for those communities later on. The local match for economically disadvantaged rural communities is 10%. This year, the available funding nationally is $2.295 billion, more than double than what it was last year. FMA is FEMA's flagship program to reduce flood risk to NFIP insured properties. The available funding this year is $800 million, again, an unprecedented amount of funding. The local match for FMA varies between 0%, 10%, and 25%, depending on the project and the type of property that's being mitigated. Not included here is the pre-disaster mitigation program, which was phased out and replaced by BRIC in 2020, but has been revamped as direct congressional appropriations. We're not going to talk about PDM in this webinar, just the three, HMGP, BRIC, and FMA. So this timeline is a general timeline that includes all three dates for all three programs. I won't spend too much time. I'm not going to go through each of these since we'll get into important dates for each program as we move through the webinar. For now, key things I want to highlight are that in September, so we're into September, and DHSEM is actively receiving, reviewing, and approving notices of interest for these funding programs, as well as completed applications for HMGP. So some of you may, be in the midst of developing those sub-application. Key dates for HMGP are the deadlines to FEMA, which are coming up in November and December. These dates may be extended. I included a note here. If FEMA approves additional extensions for the application deadlines. As for BRIC and FMA, FEMA is currently hosting their series of webinars. I encourage you all to listen to some of those. They are recorded and available on FEMA's website. The application period for both programs begins on September 30th. What that means is that the FEMA Grants Outcome portal, FEMA Go, opens up to start developing those sub-applications. BRIC and FMA draft sub-applications are due to DHSEM by November 4th, and we'll talk more about these dates as we move through the webinar. So next up, we're going to talk about the HMGP Notice of Funding. So this is an updated amount of funding that's available per disaster. So right now, Colorado has 3 open HMGP disasters: DR 4498, which is COVID-19, DR 4634, the Marshall Fire, and then the post-fire related to the same, FM 5423. So right now, what we're looking at is, less than that 70 million that I quoted at the beginning. So 38.6 million available for 4498, which is the biggest pot. As sub-applications are finalized, DHSEM will submit them to FEMA for review and award. The first deadline is for DR 4498, which represents the largest bucket of funding. Importantly, when you submit your sub-application, the state really decides which funding bucket it's submitted under. So you don't necessarily have to worry about which funding program you're being submitted under. They'll inform you and also inform you of any implications to your grant, such as for pre-award costs and the period of performance deadlines. So some key tenets of HMGP, and many of you may be familiar with this, right? Having submitted Hazard Mitigation Grant Program applications in the past. You must be an eligible sub-applicant, meaning you are a local government entity, a state-level agency, a special district, a tribal government, or a nonprofit organization. Individual businesses and individuals are not eligible sub-applicants, and they have to work with an eligible entity if they're interested in mitigating their home or business. The entity must also have a FEMA approved and adopted hazard mitigation plan. No construction or groundbreaking activities may take place prior to FEMA award, or the project may not be or is probably not eligible for funding. You must submit an NOI to DHSEM and receive the green light from DHSEM before moving forward with a full sub-application. The project scope of work must clearly demonstrate a level of protection increase from natural hazard risk. So we want to see a clear reduction in natural hazard risk to people, infrastructure, and structures. Any projects with construction or physical work, such as wildfire projects, must develop a benefit cost analysis using FEMA's tools and methodologies, and those projects must have a benefit cost ratio of 1 or greater. The sub-applicant must be able to meet the local match requirements, and we'll get into what that looks like under HMGP in just a moment. Projects under HMGP must be completed within 36 months from the date of the application, the date that the application period opens. So for HMGP, that's the declaration dates, most generally. The project must be an independent mitigation solution, meaning that the effectiveness of the proposed project is not dependent on another project or funding source to be met. This is a reimbursement-based program, and in order to be reimbursed costs incurred, the procurement of the vendors must be compliant with 2 CFR 200. In addition, the projects must also comply with all federal, state, and local environmental and historic preservation laws. And generally, the project must address the Colorado prioritization criteria, which we'll discuss in full in this webinar. So the next thing we'll talk about are the sub-application types that can be submitted under HMGP. This table outlines the description, examples, and the applicability of the benefit cost analysis to the different types of sub-applications. This includes the planning and planning-related activities. The reason I have 7% up here is that these projects can be no more than 7% of the total available HMGP funding. Projects, the second tranche here is projects and phase projects, which is the bulk of where the funding goes. Advanced assistance, otherwise known as project scoping, and lastly, 5% initiative projects. Planning activities can include the development of new or updated or updates to the local hazard mitigation plans, the development of specific hazard plans, and the evaluation of codes and ordinances. Note that any planning related activities must tie back to your local hazard mitigation plan. So they either have to enhance or build off of the local hazard mitigation plan. The project and phase projects, like I said, take up the bulk of the funding. These are the construction and physical work projects. This includes wildfire mitigation, floodplain and stream restorations, property acquisitions, drainage improvements, etc. Advanced assistance sub-applications are developed when a sub-applicant knows there's a problem, but maybe doesn't fully understand the problem, doesn't have a solution for that hazard risk. These sub-applications request funding to complete feasibility studies, engineering and design plans, environmental studies, and benefit cost analyses. A BCA is not required for advanced assistance, but is one of the deliverables you would develop as part of the implementation of the grant. Finally, the 5% initiative projects are projects that are difficult to evaluate using a BCA, but that offer risk reduction to the community, such as hazard warning systems are a great example. These projects do not require a BCA, but the sub-applicant must provide a narrative explaining how the project is effective at reducing risk to the benefiting community. And these are the state mitigation priorities. These are priorities that are highlighted on DHSEM's Notice of Funding Opportunity. The state is prioritizing projects that benefit underserved and socially vulnerable populations, and that's defined by the community. Also prioritized are projects that reduce risk from at least one of Colorado's most critical natural hazards. So that includes drought, flood, wildfire, and severe winter weather. The third prioritization applies only to wildfire hazardous fuels reduction projects. So those projects that are located outside of the Colorado Strategic Wildfire Action Program, and that's a Colorado Department of Natural Resources program. So hazardous fuels reduction projects that are outside of those areas are prioritized over those that are in those areas, and that's because those projects in the COSWAP area will receive funding through the Colorado Department of Natural Resources. Mark, I don't know if you wanted to add anything else about the Colorado Strategic Wildfire Action Program.
Thanks, Vanessa. I won't try and speak for their program other than to say if your wildfire project includes defensible space, then that third bullet won't apply because COSWAP doesn't do defensible space. So we don't want to disadvantage their strategic areas in an area, in an activity that DNR won't fund or conduct.
Thanks, Mark. So the notice of interest and sub-application submission, this is for HMGP. So those of you that are interested in any of the funding that we discussed, including HMGP, but also BRIC and FMA, should submit a notice of interest to DHSEM as soon as possible. DHSEM accepts NOIs on a rolling basis, but if you're interested in the available HMGP, you should be submitting an NOI now, essentially. Developing a FEMA-ready sub-application can take up to 3 months. We included a link to the NOI in the slide deck, and it's also available on the DHSEM mitigation page, as well as the email signature block for the DHSEM mitigation staff. Once DHSEM approves your NOI, you will proceed with developing your full sub-application in coemgrants.com. That's the system of record for DHSEM and the application form that will be submitted to FEMA for review. And again, this is for HMGP. Importantly, the available HMGP, so you know the deadlines that are coming up in November and December, have an increased federal cost share for all sub-applicants. The cost share is 90% federal, 10% non-federal, which is especially advantageous for smaller or resource-strapped communities. These sub-applications are due in early November, like I said, and late December. These dates are subject to change pending an application deadline extension from FEMA. But I still encourage you to submit your NOIs as soon as possible. And if you're working on those sub-applications, get them in as soon as possible, just so that you can be part of that funding bucket. So funding state deadlines, and this is for HMGP. The draft sub-applications for the first bucket of HMGP that has a 10% non-federal share are due October 3rd. The second bucket is due November 30th. And then the third, which doesn't have that increased cost share, is due February 27th. I'm going to pause here and see if we have any questions on HMGP or any of those dates.
No questions in the chat.
Thanks, Jason. So what we're going to talk about next is the Colorado Resiliency Framework scoring. And this is the scoring that the state applies to all mitigation projects. So that includes HMGP, BRIC, and FMA sub-applications. The major themes of the framework are shown here. So addressing climate change and adaptation, reducing risks from natural and other hazards, increasing social equity and bolstering unique community needs, and finally, promoting economic diversity and vibrancy. And that comes directly from the Colorado Resiliency Framework. I've linked that here on this slide. So what we're going to talk about here, we listed out all of the criteria. This is available in the DHSEM Notice of Funding Opportunity. Again, that's linked on the DHSEM mitigation page, as well as, like I said, in the email blocks of all the mitigation staff. The first criterion is co-benefits, meaning projects that address multiple sectors to create a holistic community benefit. The sectors in the framework are community, economy, health and social, housing, infrastructure, and watersheds and natural resources. The second is innovation, meaning a prioritization of projects that incorporate creative methods and technology into the mitigation solutions. So just to follow, these are additional criteria. The third criterion is high risk and vulnerability. To receive these points, projects must clearly identify what the risk is and what the risk is to human well-being, infrastructure, and natural systems, with an emphasis on reducing risk to the most marginalized. This aligns well with some of the BRIC and FMA criteria as well. For a project to receive points under adaptive capacity, the project must show that it is addressing potential future conditions, such as climate, economic, and social conditions. The economic benefit cost is measured through a project's benefit cost analysis. So if you're submitting a construction project, a wildfire project, you will have a BCA, and that will help to inform how many points you get here. So finally, we have, these are the last 4 criteria that are part of the Colorado Resiliency Framework. These criteria highlight key characteristics of projects, including projects that expand on mitigation and resiliency initiatives that are already taking place in a community, projects that would benefit increased social equity, projects that have long-term and lasting impact, meaning projects that not only benefit present generations, but also future generations. And finally, all projects must demonstrate technical feasibility. That is, they are adopting best practices, they're compliant with code and floodplain management requirements, and are aligned with industry standards. The next piece that we're going to talk about is the BRIC Notice of Funding Opportunity. I am going to pause just to see if we have any questions on the Colorado Resiliency Framework.
No questions in the chat, Vanessa.
Thanks, Jason. So just for administrative purposes, and many of you may already be aware, the federal government transitioned away from DUNS to the Unique Entity Identifier, the UEI. If your organization had an active registration in the System for Awards, so SAM, prior to April 4th, 2022, the UEI has been automatically assigned to you and no action is required. If you're not registered in SAM and need a UEI, then you should do so. You should start that registration process as soon as possible. It can take up to 4 months. You do need a UEI if you're applying for BRIC or FMA funding. The next piece we're going to talk about are key tenets of the BRIC program. So these are very similar to HMGP. Some key differences under BRIC are that non-profit organizations are not eligible as independent sub-applicants. It must apply through an eligible entity, such as a local government, a tribal government, or a state-level agency. Sub-applicants can request a longer period of performance with their sub-application. A justification is required. I think that the longest period of performance we've seen approved in BRIC has been around 50 months. Unlike in HMGP, pre-award costs do not have a time limit. So pre-award costs are costs that are associated with developing your sub-application, developing engineering and feasibility reports, and conducting environmental planning. Like I said, you don't need that doesn't have a time restriction. So if you're actively developing engineering plans. You don't have to wait for that application period to open in order for those to be eligible. These projects must be competitive using the FEMA BRIC program technical and qualitative evaluation criteria, and I really can't emphasize that enough. FEMA has said very clearly, right, these are the keys to the test, right? So applying that criteria really makes your project competitive for the BRIC funding. And some key takeaways from the last 2 years. So BRIC has only been around for 2 years. First and foremost, what we've noticed, obviously, is that projects must be eligible, feasible, and cost-effective. This applies to all FEMA mitigation programs, and it's still true for the BRIC program. As I just mentioned, projects must be competitive by maximizing the scoring rubrics. The criteria must be addressed throughout the sub-application. So in your scope of work, in the supporting documentation that you upload, in the evaluation section. Generally, FEMA has funded projects that address the highest regional hazards. For example, FEMA funded drought in Utah, wildfire in California, and tsunami mitigation in Washington State. BRIC has prioritized funding to projects that benefit disadvantaged communities, and we'll talk about this a lot more in the coming slides. Generally, the BRIC projects have incorporated nature-based solutions, future conditions, and climate adaptive solutions. Strong building code adoption continues to be a priority for success. So only 1% of the BRIC funding in 2021 went to states without statewide codes, and that was in Wisconsin and Wyoming, and both had partial codes. They had international building codes. Phasing projects continues to be a competitive strategy. So especially in situations where a project does not have the technical body of work needed to establish technical feasibility, phasing that project is a good way of, making the project more competitive. Finally, projects should seek public-private partnerships where they are available. It's a competitive approach to the local share and can help communities overmatch, which is in and of itself a competitive criterion. So as I've mentioned quite a bit, right, it's an unprecedented amount of funding, about double what it was last year. 2.295 billion are available nationwide. Within that total, there are 3 buckets. First, there's the state and territory allocation for 112 million. Each state and territory gets 2 million. What that means is that the state of Colorado has a $2 million allocation. They can use this funding towards small mitigation projects, capability and capacity building activities, including project scoping, and towards subrecipient management costs. Second is the tribal set aside for 50 million. Federally recognized tribes may apply as applicants directly to FEMA to access this funding, and it may be used for the same activities as the state allocation. And then third, and the biggest bucket, is a national competition with $2.13 billion. This is where those large mitigation projects are submitted under. The federal share cap for mitigation projects is 50 million. That's the same as last year. So the state allocation. So this is that small bucket that I was talking about. It's the state of Colorado has 2 million. And again, that can be used towards small mitigation projects as well as the capability and capacity building activities. And I've listed what those eligible activities are here. That includes project scoping, building code activities, partnership activities, hazard mitigation planning activities. The project scoping, I think, is the most interesting of the bunch. This is essentially seed funding. They can be used towards trying to figure out what your mitigation problem is and identify what the solution would be. Deliverables of a project scoping application may include an alternative analysis, project design plans, a benefit cost analysis, and environmental planning activities. So the BRIC program priorities for fiscal year 22, and this is as reported in the Notice of Funding Opportunity. Mitigation, so the program is prioritizing mitigation to public infrastructure and benefits to disadvantaged communities, projects that incorporate nature-based solutions into their mitigation approaches, and lastly, they're increasing funding to communities that promote the adoption and enforcement of the latest building codes. So codes keep coming up, and you'll see them come up in the technical criteria as well. So one key piece of both BRIC and FMA is the Justice 40 initiative, which really drives the prioritization of benefits to disadvantaged communities. It's in keeping with the goals of Executive Order 14008. Through the Justice 40 initiative, 40% of BRIC and FMA funds in fiscal year 22 must be invested in projects that directly benefit disadvantaged communities. BRIC uses the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention Social Vulnerability Index as a tool to identify areas as disadvantaged. This is a mapping tool that we'll showcase on a future slide. Areas with a CDC SVI score of greater than or equal to 0.6 are considered disadvantaged. FEMA embedded this prioritization in the competitive criteria for both BRIC and FMA. Of the 6 qualitative criteria for the BRIC program, 4 make direct mention of benefits to disadvantaged communities or the inclusion of these communities in project development. For example, in one instance is how these communities are engaged through the planning process and how they are participating in project selection and design, as well as what types of direct benefits do these communities gain from the mitigation activities. The key here really is to go beyond the mapping exercise and engage these communities in identifying projects, designing projects, and in the overall resiliency programs. It'll make it easier to showcase your work and your sub-application, to showcase your outreach to these disadvantaged communities and what the benefits are when you're developing your sub-application. So here is the, this is what the CDC Social Vulnerability Index looks like. This is the tool, like I said, that FEMA is going to use to determine if a project benefiting area is disadvantaged. You should upload a copy of this map highlighting the project benefiting area to your sub-application. And we've linked this tool here for those of you who haven't accessed it yet. Different from disadvantaged communities slightly is the economically disadvantaged rural community. It's a special designation in the BRIC program. These are communities that are defined as 3,000 individuals or fewer, with residents having an average per capita annual income not exceeding 80% of the national per capita income that's based on best available data. A change this year is that another entity can apply on behalf of an EDRC, which helps EDRCs who may not have the staff resources required to put in a FEMA sub-application together. So in previous years, the EDRC would have needed to submit the sub-application and prepare the sub-application on their own to be eligible. This year and hopefully moving forward, a state level agency or another local government can apply on behalf of an EDRC if they're working with that EDRC, right? Note that all economically disadvantaged rural communities will be disadvantaged for the purposes of the Justice 40 initiative, which we just talked about, but not all disadvantaged communities under Justice 40 are EDRCs. EDRCs are eligible for an increased cost share up to 90% federal share. It must be requested in the sub-application. The BRIC program has a technical evaluation criteria for overmatching. If an EDRC chooses to overmatch, all they need to do is provide 12%, not that 30% overmatch. So the cost share, for those of you familiar with the FEMA mitigation programs, is standard. It's 75% federal, 25% non-federal for BRIC sub-applications. Like I just mentioned, economically disadvantaged rural communities are eligible for 90% non-federal. Cost share can include cash, third-party and in-kind services, materials, or in-house staff time. Other federal grant dollars can generally be used, and what I've seen, for other federal programs that are eligible as local match or CDBGD are, and then now the American Rescue Plan funds, specifically the coronavirus state and local fiscal recovery funds, can be used as local match. So here is the evaluation criteria for BRIC, and this is what I was talking about before as sort of the key to the funding. Maximizing these points is really critical for gaining access and having a competitive project under the BRIC program. The reason Colorado sub-applicants can only receive 95 of the 115 points is that Colorado does not have statewide codes. State codes are 20 make up that difference, that 20-point difference. The implication of this is that the Colorado BRIC sub-applications really have to maximize the other criteria to be competitive. So mitigation to infrastructure, incorporation of nature-based solutions. The sub-applicant should have a building code effectiveness grading schedule of 1 to 5, and I included a link in another slide for the building code effectiveness grading schedule. And then you also want, if able, increase that non-federal cost share to at least 30% unless you are an EDRC, and then all you would need to provide is that 12%. And then finally, really maximizing that benefit to disadvantaged communities where possible, just again, to make a competitive project under the BRIC program. Qualitative, and this is the second piece. So technical was first, qualitative scoring evaluation criteria second. These are scored on a gradient scale by a panel of reviewers. The technical criteria are reviewed by FEMA. Some things here to highlight. Again, these really should be maximized and addressed directly throughout the sub-application. In addition, you should upload supporting documentation where relevant. For example, to support how future conditions impact the project design. Future conditions can include climate change, population and demographic changes, and land use changes that are impacting your project design and identification. Other important considerations include the maximization of benefits to disadvantaged communities. I know I'm sounding like a broken record, but this really cannot be emphasized enough, right? 40% of this funding needs to go to benefiting those communities. And then the incorporation of ancillary benefits in the project design. For example, does the project result in a reduction in carbon emissions? Does it address community inequities? Does it protect natural resources? That's the type of language, the type of information that you want to highlight in your sub-application. And then here are some key BRIC dates. These are, these support that first timeline that I showed you all. What I want to highlight is that the FEMA Go sub-application opens September 30th. You must first submit an NOI to DHSEM before starting a sub-application. DHSEM will really route the project to the funding source that is most suitable. If you have a green light from DHSEM to work on a sub-application in FEMA Go, the draft sub-application will be due to DHSEM by November 4th. The state must submit their sub-application packet to FEMA by January 27th, 2023, so next year. The next piece we're going to talk about is the FMA program. I am going to pause just to see if we have any questions in the chat or any questions from the group. Hearing none, I'll proceed. So FMA, and you'll see this slide quite a bit. Again, the tenants are pretty much the same. What's important to take away here is that FMA must reduce risk to NFIP structures, and that's for all projects, project scoping, individual flood mitigation projects, and localized flood risk reduction projects. They must benefit NFIP structures. Along with this, in order to maximize benefits to the NFIP, FMA really prioritizes severe repetitive loss and repetitive loss properties, and we include definitions for these terms in a future slide. Another difference under FMA are the varied non-federal cost shares, depending on the project and property types, and I'll get into those in a bit. And as with BRIC, FMA also prioritizes or has prioritization criteria, that must be maximized in order to be competitive for this funding. They do look different than the BRIC criteria, but again, similarly, you really want to maximize those in order to be competitive. So the FMA Notice of Funding Opportunity for 2022, like I mentioned, right, it's really unprecedented. This is 4 times the amount of funding this program has seen in previous years. Unlike BRIC, there is no state territory allocation or a tribal set aside. Instead, the funding is really separated into 3 buckets. First, we have the capability and capacity building activities. Similar to BRIC, multi-hazard plans are crossed off here because DHSEM is funneling the mitigation plans into HMGP since they have so much available. The second bucket is for the localized flood risk reduction projects. These were previously known as community flood mitigation projects. The federal cap was increased this year from 30 million to 50 million. And then also a change from last year, communities can request a longer period of performance for these localized flood risk reduction projects. Finally, we have the bread and butter of the FMA program, which is the individual flood mitigation projects. These are property acquisitions, structure elevations, dry flood proofing, and structural retrofitting. All properties submitted under an individual flood mitigation sub-application must have an active NFIP policy at the start of the application period, which is September 30th, right? So it's not the date that you submit the sub-application, it's September 30th that those NFIP policies have to be in place. So capability and capacity building activities. FMA has really adopted this from the BRIC program. We talked about multi-hazard plans, right? So DHSEM is funneling these into HMGP, but there are additional CNCB activities that can be submitted for under here, including SR, severe repetitive loss and repetitive loss strategies. If your community has a lot of those properties, developing a strategy is now an eligible sub-application. What I think is very interesting this year for FMA is that FEMA may provide up to 90% federal cost for activities benefiting areas with a CDC SVI score of 0.5 or greater than 0.5, excuse me. So if you're doing a project scoping activity, for example, for a localized flood risk reduction project in an area of high vulnerability, you may be eligible for this increased federal cost share. And then, similarly to what I've talked about, right, these projects must still show that they reduce flood claims against the NFIP. So that is key throughout FMA. So the localized flood risk reduction, these were previously known as the community flood mitigation projects. As I've mentioned, right, the cap has been increased to 50 million per project sub-application. Some examples of eligible activities include floodwater storage and diversion, and we do see a lot of these in Colorado, stormwater management, and then floodplain, wetland, marsh restoration. You know, I sat in on the FEMA webinar, and they really, you know, a system-wide approach to flood risk reduction is really what they're looking for, right? So incorporating different components and really as well as, right, incorporating these nature-based solutions into your project design to make for a more competitive project under the FMA program. Similar to what I said previously, right, FEMA may provide 90% federal cost share if the project benefiting area is within an area that has a CDC social vulnerability score of greater than 0.5. What that means is, right, not necessarily where the project is located, but where those benefits are going. And if it's going to census tracts or an area with a score that is greater than that 0.5, then the project would be eligible for a 90% federal cost share. And again, you have to show that NFIP properties are in that project benefiting area and that that's where the benefits are going, right? And you would be required to submit a map identifying those NFIP properties in your project benefiting area. Individual flood mitigation projects. I think a lot of folks are familiar with these. You know, as I mentioned, these are the property acquisition and structure demolition or relocation, structure elevation, dry flood proofing of historic residential structures, structural retrofitting of existing buildings. There is no funding cap, so different from the localized flood risk reduction projects, there is no federal funding cap for these sub-applications. So, you know, if you're a community with high amounts of repetitive loss or severe repetitive loss, I don't know that there are many in Colorado, but if there are, right, this could be a project for you. This is what I was talking about before, right? The varied federal cost share. These are really competitive cost shares, and I think what sets FMA apart. So if you have those severe repetitive loss structures, the federal government will pay for 100% of the costs. For repetitive loss structures, 90%. And then for properties located in areas with a social vulnerability index score of greater than 0.5, those are again also eligible for an increased cost share, and that is different from previous years. So these are the FMA definitions. You will have a copy of these slides, but these are the definitions you want to apply when looking for your severe repetitive loss properties and your repetitive loss properties. These are also available through the state floodplain administrator, I believe, so there is an existing list. If you're thinking of applying for FMA and if you're thinking of applying for an individual flood mitigation project, you really want to get a copy of that list for your community as soon as possible. The data sharing has been going pretty slow, so getting a copy of that sooner rather than later is well, I encourage that. Some key dates, these are the same as for the BRIC program, right? So draft sub-applications must be completed in the FEMA Go portal by November 4th. What that means is that DHSEM will review your sub-applications between November and into December, issue any requests for information that are needed, and really finalize that sub-application before they have to submit it to FEMA on January 27th. Any questions on the FMA program?
No questions in the chat, Vanessa.
Thanks, Jason. So what we've done here is sort of summarized all of that information to really kind of get at, you know, where should I apply if I have a project? How do I best leverage the funding that's out there? You know, are the projects that I have in mind, are they competitive for this funding, and does it make sense for me to apply? So these are our recommendations for funding. DHSEM will ultimately make the determination of where your project should be submitted based on the project and the state's funding goals. If you're a city with strong building code enforcement, your proposed project is a climate adaptive solution that benefits a vulnerable community, then BRIC might be the best program, right? If you identify a project in a community or neighborhood with high NFIP participation, high rates of repetitive loss and severe repetitive loss properties, then FMA might be the best bet, especially because of the amount of funding in that program this year. If your project doesn't quite meet the national competitive objectives, but it's still a good mitigation project, it reduces hazard risk to people, structures, or critical infrastructure, HMGP is the best bet. And HMGP is great because you're only competing with other Colorado communities and you're not competing at the national level. Colorado also has, like we've talked about, right, a lot of available HMGP with increased cost shares. That 90-10 is really unprecedented, and you know, if you're able to take advantage of that, I really encourage you to do so. So some new eligibility considerations that were released in the Notice of Funding Opportunity. So for BRIC, hazard mitigation projects should consider the amount of carbon emissions generated, and that's kind of spoken to in the Notice of Funding Opportunity. Try to incorporate climate data, including high winds, changes in precipitation events, and the impacts of extreme temperatures on heat, drought, and wildfire, which we know is, you know, these are critical hazards in Colorado right now. For FMA, like I mentioned, right, there's a new cost share for disadvantaged communities, that 90 federal share. And then for both of these programs, there's a lot of language about the preference for environmentally friendly construction practices in project implementation. And again, that's for both BRIC and FMA. And then there are certain cybersecurity activities are allowed as eligible costs in an otherwise eligible project. And I've included a link here to the cybersecurity activities that are eligible. Finally, as part of the Infrastructure and Jobs Act, the Build America, Buy America Act applies to both the BRIC and FMA projects. So you would be required to be in compliance with Build America, Buy America if you're submitting a project under these, barring a waiver. And a waiver would be issued by the state. And one last point that I think is also really useful for this round of BRIC and FMA funding, FEMA will provide assistance to economically disadvantaged rural communities, federally recognized tribes, and communities with a high level of social vulnerability, so a score of greater than 0.8 in developing BCAs, where the communities are unable to calculate a benefit cost ratio to demonstrate cost effectiveness. So the projects must still be eligible and they still must be competitive. And if they are, essentially FEMA will work with you on developing that BCA. And more guidance is pending on how this assistance will be given by FEMA. But in one of their webinars, what they mentioned, right, was, you know, in these cases, these applications can be submitted to FEMA without a BCA. If they're selected for further review because they're eligible and competitive, FEMA will then work with the community on, you know, building that BCA. And that's critical, right? The BCA has been a big challenge in previous years. So some next steps for these programs, I'll start over here. Really, if you haven't done so already and you're interested in funding, especially considering that increased federal cost share for HMGP, please submit an NOI as soon as possible to DHSEM. I included the link again here. Register in COEM grants if you haven't done so already. if DHSEM gives you the green light on your NOI, that's where you'll be submitting your sub-application for HMGP. You want to determine what a local match, that a local match can be provided and where that source is coming from. And then, again, you want to start assembling that high-level scope, schedule, and budget material. Gather any data points that you may need for the benefit cost analysis. And then, start sort of summarizing the community outreach that you've already done. For the BRIC and FMA programs, like I mentioned, right, if you don't have your UEI or you're not registered in SAM, you really want to do that as soon as possible. Attend those FEMA BRIC webinars. They are really useful. They give you a lot of critical information for developing your sub-application. If you haven't done so already, we encourage you to obtain your building code effectiveness grading schedule rating. And this is a link to where you can access that. Discuss partnership opportunities for local match, maybe with some private partners. And then if you think that you are an EDRC, you want to confirm that, speak with the DHSEM mitigation team and see if you would be eligible as one to get that increased cost share. And then finally, become familiar with the technical and qualitative evaluation criteria. That's really how you maximize the competitiveness of your project for these funding programs. And I think that may be it. So now I'll stop talking and see if any of you have any questions.
Hey, Vanessa, before that, I do want to emphasize 3 points from this presentation for folks to keep in mind. You mentioned that Colorado doesn't get 20 points in the BRIC technical criteria due to the lack of a statewide building code, but it's important to point out that that is not an insurmountable obstacle. FEMA highlighted this year that both Wisconsin and Wyoming received competitive projects despite their lack of a code. But to reemphasize something Vanessa said, it just means you have to be really, really strong at the other 12 criteria in a BRIC application. Part of why we want to do the notice of interest first is to make sure that you're pursuing an eligible project type before you get into an actual application. And what I mean by that is if you think about wildfire, for example, there are some places or activities that we can't fund with FEMA, and it would be a waste of your time to do an application with us, but we might be able to point you towards another funding source that can meet your needs. We also want to make sure that your activity or your project meets FEMA's definition of mitigation, which is long-term risk reduction, and doesn't fall into what we would consider a response or preparedness activity, such as an evacuation route in a one-way in, one-way out community. That's not an eligible activity, and we want to make those determinations with you early in the process to, again, save you the time and effort of an application for something that FEMA is not going to fund. And then finally, Vanessa mentioned several times the deadlines for the BRIC and FMA applications. And you might be wondering why we want the drafts on November 4th and why we want the final versions on December 9th. And the reason for that is there will be several iterations probably of feedback and corrections and improvements between the draft date in November and the final date in December, also keeping in mind Veterans Day and the Thanksgiving weekend. And we want the final versions before most county governments and maybe municipal governments go into their break. For example, it's very common for a lot of boards of county commissioners to not convene after their second meeting in December and not reconvene until the second week of January. So we want to make sure that the entire technical assistance process is completed before that happens. Also, we want to give the members of the state scoring panel time to actually review the applications in a deliberate and thoughtful manner before we do score and prioritize them in January, which will be the last thing we do before we submit them to FEMA. So I just wanted to add some emphasis to those 3 points, and also thank Vanessa and the team at Haggerty for helping or for putting this together. And with that, we'll open it up for questions.
Thanks, Mark. We did leave about 15 minutes for questions, so if anyone has any. And if you don't want to ask your question today, we also included the email addresses for Mark, Matt, and Jessica, who are the leadership mitigation folks at DHSEM. You know, if you have questions on anything that we presented on today, or, you know, you have a project idea that you just want to talk about before, you know, submitting an NOI, for example, feel free to reach out to any one of them, and then, you know, if needed, they can connect you with us as well, with the Haggerty team. So we're supporting DHSEM on the administration of the HMGP program. All right. Well, hearing none, I will end the webinar a little early. Mark, unless you want to hang on for any straggler questions.
Yeah, Vanessa, let's just stick around for about 5 more minutes.
Okay, sounds good.
You know, just in case. But and Tracy, the slides will be available along with this recorded webinar on the DHSEM website. Hopefully later today, but you know, by tomorrow. Certainly does take the recording some time to process.
Vanessa and Mark, thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks for attending.
So Tracy, there's not really a deadline for the NOI. The deadlines are more focused on the applications themselves. But you should give yourself, what do you think, Vanessa, 4 or 5 weeks between an NOI and an application based on the benefit cost analysis and scope of work development?
Yeah, that would be at the lower end for sure. Mm-hmm. Yeah, you want to give yourself enough time between the NOI and having to develop the sub-application. The sub-applications, depending if you're doing a construction project, they can be really intensive, especially that benefit cost analysis just requires a lot of data collection, requires a lot of coordination with entities outside of your organization. So the sooner you can get started on that sub-application, the better. All right, looks like we're losing folks. So Mark, I will end the webinar here, and then hopefully we get questions